Let's talk about control over data and the role of patient organizations in it.
Yes, data gathering is changing with the rising amount of digital technologies, wearables, and sensors. Clinical trials are starting to be redefined and decentralized, so we are seeing quite big changes in the way real-world data is collected. But we'll hear more about that in the next session.
Please give a warm welcome to Valentina Strammiello, the head of programs at the European Patients Forum, who will be facilitating the discussion on the first plenary today called Patient Organizations' Role in Driving the Work on Real-World Data and Real-World Evidence. Valentina, floor is yours.
Thank you, Yvette and Tiasha, for this warm welcome. So I'm happy to invite to the stage Elisabeth Kasilingam, who is the CEO of the European Multiple Sclerosis Platform and board member of EPF. Emile Schokker, who is head of real-world solution for EMEA at IQVIA. And then we have Xavier Kurz, who's actually the head of data analytics at EMEA. And then finally, we have Kristof Vanfraechem, founder and CEO of Data for Patients. And with this, I will give directly the floor to Kristof to give an introductory speech.
Thank you. Valentina, can you hear me? Yeah, sounds like it. Okay, I have 10 minutes to try to get my slides up. We're not there yet. No, back. 10 minutes to tee up a debate, and I'll try to go as quickly as my timer is already running. I'll try to go as quickly as I can. 10 minutes to talk about the role of patient organizations in driving real-world data. I have two messages for you. There it is. I have two messages for the audience. One message is for the patient organizations in the room. The other message is for the stakeholders of those patient organizations in the room. The message for the patient organizations in the room is you've been fighting for decades to have a seat at the table. Your time is now, and you have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to impact the future of digital healthcare as it's being designed. It's now to do that. Start loving the data topic now, or you will hate it forever. We'll get into that in more detail. The second topic is to the stakeholders of the patient organizations in the room. There are four groups, the thought leaders on data, as I see them, that are intentionally collaborating: Duchenne, CF, MS, and hemophilia. Those European patient organizations are intentionally forming a new collaboration around the data topic specifically. If you're looking for leadership in the patient organization community on the data topic, those people are joining forces, learning from each other, sharing best practices to be those strategic thought partners for those who are looking for them. We said it yesterday, we've heard it so many times, healthcare is changing. It's not just one of the stakeholders in healthcare that is changing towards digital, it's healthcare. Everyone is looking for new models. And everyone's, in my opinion, very well aware that they need to bring patients along. Trust, data quality, it's been mentioned so many times. We cannot go through all these stakeholders, but I'll focus on the clinical teams and the researchers because those are in the room and on stage. Clinical care teams, decentralized trials, virtual hospitals, remote diagnostics, digital health, you name it. Essentially, all those initiatives point towards a place where patients are not coming into the hospital or into the physician's office, they're staying at home, and they are the ones who have to generate, consolidate, and share ever more data with their care team who they're not seeing. So patients need to learn how to do this, need to get education, needs to get trust in the system to share ever more data, right? Patient organizations exist because healthcare is not great at engaging patients. It's fair enough. That's why patient organizations have created themselves. I see a key role for patient organizations to enable that model, that remote care that clinicians, clinical systems are looking to create. Patient organizations could be the ones that can make the link with patients and help that system work. Researchers. We have a key researcher from EMEA sitting on stage with us here. EMEA, I think the best example I can think of data that EMEA needs to make the best decisions for us on the benefit risk of our medications is not, in my opinion, widely available. It's whether we take our drugs when we're at home or not, and when we experience side effects or benefits when we're at home. If patients don't collect that data, nobody has that data. The closest researchers can get on analyzing the benefit risk of drugs is whether the patient picked it up at the pharmacy. That's the closest that you can find in safety databases. There needs to be a lot more data in the systems on what happens when patients are at home, and drug use is a great example of that. Without that data, that fine-tuning of that benefit risk assessment, certainly not at a personalized level, it cannot happen. As I said, I'm not going to go through, we're already 4 minutes in, I'm not going to go through all the other stakeholders, but the message here is all of those stakeholders are going to start reaching out ever more to the patient organizations, looking for the leadership to help figure out how we bring patients along in that story. 4 groups are intentionally joining forces: hemophilia, Duchenne, MS, and CF Europe, to bring their best practices together, make that data problem theirs, and take the lead. As it was said so many times yesterday, they should be. On the bottom left corner, CF Europe, I would like to share an example of a father of 2 mucoviscidose or cystic fibrosis patients in Sweden. 7-8 years ago, he started developing an app that by now 75% of the CF families in Sweden use, and that app collects data that patients use to project manage their self-care, but it was co-designed with the Karolinska Institute. So all the prompts that are collected there are research grade. The prompts are shared with the clinician can see it in his clinical decision-making system. It makes sense to the physician as he sees the data come into his system. It's not an additional report. The data that's collected is by the physician pushed right into the national registries. So it actually becomes part of the system. And last but not least, when patients track, for instance, their medication use, it's the actual prescription record. It's not just data that's collected, it's connected to the national e-prescription system. So you've got all the pieces coming together, and patients, 75% of them, using it on a daily basis because it fixes their problems. It was designed first with the patient in mind, and then everyone else gets it. So I think that's a great example of how patient organizations can drive that long-term partnership with the patient community in a way that actually designs collaboration but fixes problems patients want, so they actually use it. The apps don't become part of the graveyard of apps that are great ideas nobody uses. That's a CF example, but MS and CF, it's actually the patient organizations who 10, 20 years ago took the initiative for creating the clinical registries, the registries that are now used for real-world data analysis by EMEA. It was their initiative. My view is that the patient organizations are now going to create the initiative to turn those centralized annual or visit-based systems into real-time patient-centric models of the future. I think it's going to be those patient organizations who now, again, are going to take the initiative to drive that system into that new world. Demetrius, you've heard him so many times yesterday. He's clearly a thought leader on the topic of data. Duchenne has created its own registry, right? They have their own registry, and it's FAIR. They've worked with Mark Wilkinson from FAIR, and I think that really shows that they're in it for the collection of the data and the better care, not for creating an additional silo. They want it to be fair. They want people to be able to use it for better research for their patients. So it's not a matter of competing with others. It's a matter of making sure that the right research happens for their patients and that others use it. Last but not least, the Hemophilia Consortium, led by Declan Noon, he's actually an HTA expert and a medical engineering expert. The EU has registries used for safety in Europe, and the gene therapy registry, which is a US initiative, is there to illustrate that these patient groups actually aren't just European patient groups. They have a network of expertise they can tap into globally. So that's, those are the people. We have Elisabeth here. who are leading this, and I'm very happy to help them coordinate this. They want to work together and drive the patient organization role in this new digital healthcare space strategically together and be a thought partner, a strategic thought partner for the stakeholders who are looking for leadership in this space. So I'm very happy to be supporting them, and that's... How am I doing on time? I'm early.
Perfect. Thank you, Kristof.
Do I stop that?
So this was really an introductory speech to show that this is not a vision, this is already reality, and we wanted everyone to be aware of this ongoing process. And I'd like to start the conversation with Elisabeth, because you were mentioned among the leaders in this initiative. And so, Elisabeth, what would you say about the role of patient organizations in real-world evidence generation?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the panel, and thank you for the invitation. First of all, I would say thank you to Kristof for being a great supporter of the patient organization in this field. And I think we need more supporters like this for patient organizations who believe in the role and the relevance of the involvement of the patients' organizations in a field that has been for a very long time reserved to the scientific and academic communities. So it's big steps for the patients' organizations getting into that, but we need more acknowledgement of the expertise of the patients and what they can bring on the table. It needs to be better defined, what we mean by the patient's involvement in this area. We see that there has been a lot of advancement in the real-world evidence data field and in the registries fields. We have seen during the discussion yesterday that the digital transformation is happening now, but what we don't see clearly yet, even in the proposal from the Commission and the other authorities, is how they are involving the patients' organizations in co-designing and driving this field. Because patients' organizations should drive, but they are not on the driver's seat at the moment. So it's important that we are already on the table, but that it would be even better that our expertise is acknowledged. The problem that we are facing here and the responsibility of the patients' organizations is to build that expertise, to be recognized and acknowledged as such. So we have a responsibility towards our communities to educate them better on this and to empower them to raise their voice in this type of discussion and to be able to be part of the decision-making processes. At the same time, it's the responsibility of the other stakeholders with whom we are working to really make sure that they provide to the patient organizations the tools that they require to be an equal partner in the discussion. So just to conclude, and I think we will get to that question later on, it's we as a patient organization have been facing quite many challenges being around the table and in part of the discussion, and I think that we need to address those challenges specifically in how the contribution of the patient organization is included.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth. And I would like to take the question to Emile now, really the same one. Elisabeth made some provocative statements. So what is, from your perspective, the role of patient organizations?
Thank you, Valentina. Good morning, everyone. So I sit in this panel, I guess, as the representative of industry. Of course, I only represent one part of the industry, but I'm also a patient. I was diagnosed and treated for leukemia in 2019. And that kind of overnight changed my perspective on the role of real-world evidence for patients and also the role of patient organizations, frankly. Unfortunately, I only discovered mine after I left hospital, but I can say they've been really helpful since in ways that I think no provider or physician could have helped me. So thanks to all of you who do this work kind of day and night. It's really important. Now back to the question. I've been working in the industry for over 20 years, or with the industry, I should say. And we've been talking about the role of patients and the increasing importance of patients for 20 years. And frankly, in that regard, I think the progress is too limited. I don't think we've achieved enough over that 20 years. However, I'm also a positive person, and I do see signs over the last few years that actually the role of patients is becoming more important. I see regulators taking more note, I see payers taking more note, and then, of course, as a consequence, also industry taking more note. So there's a real, I think, momentum there, and it's one of the most exciting spaces, I think, of the real-world evidence space overall. Now, of course, the benefit that patients bring is they bring a tremendous amount of commitment and dedication to the topic, right? Because of their situation. What they don't necessarily bring, of course, is lots of organization and resources. And that's where patient organizations, I think, play a vital role to bundle all that energy that comes from patients and building the infrastructures and the resources, as you mentioned, to be able to channel that energy into something productive. So I think there's a vital role for patient organizations. We look forward to having stronger patient organizations with a clearer mandate, with more expertise that can be brought to actually facilitate science. So anything that we can do to support that mission, more than happy to.
Thank you, Emile. And now I would move on to Xavier. And so can you give us an example where real-world evidence was used significantly in decision-making at EMEA?
Yes, you asked me to pick up an example. I had the choice. There are many, many examples. I took one which is Zolgensma, because this was a good example where we used patient registries as a comparator group for the clinical trial, and also where patient organizations were consulted actually during the authorization process. So this is a product that is indicated, or that was developed for spinal muscular atrophy. So this is a severe neuromuscular disorder which has different types, but type 1 and type 2 occurs in children less than 18 months and with a very high mortality. There is a rare disease, orphan disease, and this is a result of a mutation in one of the genes. And this product was developed, and it provides actually a new copy of the gene that makes the human survival motor neuron protein, which allows so to have a normal neuromuscular function. So in the development of the product, there was a clinical trial which, for ethical reasons, was a single-arm trial. So only patients receiving the product under development and no placebo, and there were 22 patients in this single-arm trial. But in order to assess the efficacy of this product, we needed to have a comparator group. And as a comparator group, we used the company submitted data from a pediatric neuromuscular clinical research database, which is a large registry of patients in the US. And originally, this registry included more than 300 patients. But then there was a selection of the patients who had the same characteristics and as the indication that was requested for the product, and there were 23. There was also another data source, which is what is called NeuroNext study, which is also a study in the US on the same type of patients. And then, well, there has been a lot of discussions and also evaluation to consider whether this group of patients in the registry was comparable at the same characteristics as the patients in the single-arm trial. And actually, it was found that the patients who were in the registry had a less severe disease than those included in the clinical trial, but this was considered acceptable because actually this was that was not favorable for the drug, so it was considered acceptable, and then it showed actually that the drug was very effective. Now, as I said, these were data that came from the US. That's why we requested the company to start, after the authorization, which took place 2 years ago, to start a registry in Europe, and there is a Restore registry that is the study that started that use data from different registries of spinal muscular atrophy patients. Now, in addition, what we started, and we started it this year, is because there will be other products coming. And we thought that we did not have enough information in terms of natural history, type of treatments that are being given to the patient. So we started our DMA, we funded our own study based on registries in 5 European countries, and this is ongoing in order that we have our own information, our own independent information, and we do not have to rely on the information provided by the companies. And so our study is being done, study is being done based on patient registries that are then followed and that contribute to the study.
Thank you, Xavier. And I mean, so far we have seen there is a positive attitude, openness to collaborate, but we are also aware that it's not a perfect world. We are not there yet. And this is an open question to the four of you. What is the biggest challenge to a smooth cooperation among different players in real-world evidence? We know it's not yet easy to collaborate. Who wants to take the floor first?
Maybe I can start. So in this field, I believe that the multi-stakeholder approach is key to be able to really move forward together and faster. But I think that there is the most important challenge we need to address is to have some standards, to establish some standards that people can already start building on. Because we've seen that there are many initiatives that are already ongoing on, but we are missing that standards, that guidelines that can help, that framework that can help us to move faster and together towards the same aim. And then there is that educational, I'm not sure if this is the right term, but the educational part towards the general population. We're talking about real-world evidence data, which is the population of as many patients as possible. And if we don't communicate and inform and empower those patients to contribute, we're already bridging a gap that we will take years to then come back and address. And there is that other issue of the gaps between the inequalities that exist across country and within the countries, across regions. So this also needs to be really considered and addressed already now if we want to have the appropriate solutions.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Emile?
Yeah, I fully concur. I think one of the big problems is the fragmentation, right? There is good data here, then there's a bit of good data there, there's a bit of good data there. But it's all collected in a different way, it's collected in using different standards. It's very difficult to connect the three to then come to a scientific outcome that Mr. Kurz would be happy to look at. And so there's lots of practical problems that we can solve by putting in more standards, using more of the tools that do exist today to actually harmonize data sets and make them more easy to interrogate and answer the scientific questions. I think there's lots of work to be done there.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, I think that what is important is that all the parties, all the persons involved talk together, and this is probably something that is not always the case. We at EMEA, we organized over the last 2 to 3 years workshop on specific disease, hemophilia, multiple sclerosis, cystic fibrosis, where we really gathered all the what we call the stakeholders, so patients, organizations, clinicians, regulators, HTA bodies, and in order to get agreement of what are the data that needs to be collected on this specific disease that are important to authorize and reimburse the drugs, what are the data that are feasible to be collected. And this is there is a discrepancy between what we want as regulators and what are in the data source. And also, what are the issues in terms of governance? So how can we, as regulators, facilitate the collection of this data? I think that having, a large number of persons in the same rooms, and we say at the end of the day, we have to agree on the end of the day of what are the data that are needed and that should be collected, and what each of you can contribute to this is very important.
And as also Kristof mentioned earlier, this is really a joint effort. All stakeholders need to come together. But during our brainstorming in preparation of this session, we realized that there is an issue with accountability. Who needs to take the leadership? Who's accountable? There is a huge burden coming with this effort, which can be financial, also in terms of human resources, building the capacity of patient organization. Who you think should take the lead? And the burden. Be open to say, I mean.
I think I said it in my opening statement. I think it's very fair to say that in healthcare, the silos are not, don't have a lot of practice in collaborating and partnering for the sake of patients. I think that's just a fair observation you can make. But patients work across the ecosystem. They have to, because that's, they have to. It's just all their organs are in one body, and their life is just one, and patient associations reflect that. They work across they're experts actually at ecosystem thinking. I think the initiative will come from the patient organizations to drive that conversation. It's taking too long. Everybody knows we need more data from patients in those registries to be able to make more deeper and broader decisions from an analytics perspective. I think it's on the leadership of the patient organizations to initiate that conversation. Will a lot of people need to contribute and build on that? Of course. But for me, the initiative will come from the patient organizations. Should come from the patient organizations also.
Any further comments?
Comment. Yes, I agree with what Kristof is saying, but I also see that because of the lack of resources, as you said, for patient organization, that's the main concern. So how do we build on this to address those questions when we have so many other issues and priority areas to work on? So it's important that for this, we have the support of the relevant institutions and organizations that can help co-finance those proposals. And when we have a proposal on the table, like the one from the Commission on the European Health Data Space, we expect more from the institution to also consider that and to be contributing to supporting the role of the patients' organizations and the accountability at the end of the day.
Can I add on to that?
Very
briefly? If we're all in agreement, and even EMEA for many years has been saying that patient organizations need to drive PROMs into the system so that better data becomes available, and everyone seems to be agreeing that there's an important role there, I think it's such a business critical role that I think the opportunity to talk about your funding model and whether it's charity or volunteering based or not, I think has never been closer. I think the system needs this expertise, is frankly counting on it. This is a conversation that's not really being had that transparently, so maybe I can just put that out there and say it. I think patient organizations tend to feel like they're still not understood. And behind closed doors, some of the stakeholders are telling me they should really be leading this more because they're right, we don't know this stuff with patient engagement as well as they do. So there's an ask for more leadership, but it cannot be the current model. I think if patient organizations play a business critical role in the data economy, we also need to talk about how can we make them part of that from a budget and system perspective. There's no other way.
Yes, Xavier.
You may know that EMEA started this year what we call the Darwin EU project, which is a project that we are funding ourselves, well, with the money from the European Commission, but we are driving it, which is building a network of data sources across Europe. And well, it is will build progressively, but we plan that in 4 years there will be at least 40 data sources. And we are in the process now of doing the onboarding of data source and selecting criteria. And we are really wishing to get patient registries in it. And there are several that have been that have shown the interest. We would like really to have them involved. And this would help them also probably getting funding, but also this provided some requirements in terms of minimum information to be collected, data standards, and so on. Yeah, so I think that there are activities to be done on both sides.
I agree. I think there's a great opportunity there.
And so we'll move now to the last round of questions, and I will start with Emile. How can an entity like yours contribute to ensure the wealth of information coming from patient organization is used at the maximum of its capacity? How you see your role in this effort?
Yeah. So IQVIA is a clinical research organization, right? I don't personally work in the clinical research part. I work in the real-world evidence part, but nevertheless, we are kind of an intermediary between the demand for evidence that comes from regulators or payers or from industry sometimes, and those that actually generate the evidence. So I think there's a role for us to lower the boundaries for evidence that is there to lead, or the data that is there to generate the evidence that is required. And one of my colleagues counted, we collaborate with 140 patient organizations globally already today. A range of different things. Sometimes it's for an individual project. It may be for an evidence need for a certain compound, for an external comparator, as Mr. Kurz just described. Or it may be more strategically to help them to build out their registry or their registry capabilities, but it's at different levels. What we also do increasingly is we build the tools to help to better include the patient voice in evidence generation. And what I personally find very encouraging is that starting to happen earlier and earlier in the research chain. So not just when the product is already on the market, but actually early into research. Tools like better understanding the burden of clinical trials on patients. Scientists like to include everything in their trials, but some things are burdensome to patients and may not necessarily add that much value. So getting that balance right is one of those things. Developing new patient-reported outcomes measures, especially for rare disease. The existing metrics don't always cover what is actually relevant for patients, and therefore we help to build and validate new outcomes metrics. We also have things like data libraries, so, and I know we're working with the EMEA on some of that to make sure that there is a more transparency on what data is out there, so that when a question comes, it becomes easier to connect with the patient organization or other people that may have the data to generate the evidence, so the burden comes down and it becomes easier. And we also work with some of the data standardization tools, the common data model. We're part of the Odyssey framework that some of you be familiar with, which makes it easier to connect data across different data settings. So I'm not saying we can't do more, we can always do more, but I think we're starting to build kind of the toolbox to make that connection easier and smoother, to reduce the cost of doing science, so we can do more science for the same budget.
Thank you, Emile. And I would ask, one question to Xavier. What are the expectations of regulators and decision makers in terms of uptake of registries? What are the recommendations you would give to patient organizations to make sure that their contribution is effective?
Yeah, you asked me the question and I started to write something on my paper and then I stopped because there were...
One example will be enough.
Yeah, so I will start with 4 or 5 things. I think from our experience of interacting with patient registries, first important aspect that we would expect from patient organization is really the fact that all patients should be informed and given the opportunity to be included in a registry. And so there is, and because this is, we see that this is not always the case. And the reason why we sometimes have to go to the US and get data from the US is because there are not enough patients in Europe to have a sample size for an analysis. So this requires informed consent, but this also requires informing the patients of the benefits actually of being part of a registry, and possibly then having to share some data, not externally, but at least to the data analysts that may do some analysis on the data. And so benefits in terms of public health, but in terms of medicine, of authorization of new medications, and also reimbursement, because for HTA bodies it's also very important. And also they should be informed that they can withdraw their consent at any case. We have to remind us that with the GDPR, the patients own the data. So they may decide actually what to do with their own data. Second aspect is having getting advice actually from patient organization on what data can be collected and what cannot be collected. As I said earlier, if we have sometimes a long list of data we would like on patients, but we would like, would be useful to know what is not available and what cannot be collected. On the other hand, we would like to have patient-reported outcomes, which is missing often.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just one thing, core data elements that would be harmonized across registries would be very, very important. Collaborations between the registries in different countries with harmonization of the processes, engagement into research. And this means governance aspects. Again, when we are contacting registries for getting the data information, many of them are not used to participate in research activities and have even the governance for who decides of whether we go to we give data or not, and it takes very long time. That is not possible for us when we need to answer questions from our scientific committees. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Xavier.
Very clear list.
Yes. And before we move to the final question, I would like to see if there is any question from the floor, from the audience, or from the online audience. Feel free, it's your turn. And it's the only one occasion to ask our panelists if you have any burning questions. We have Dimitrios. And over there, we have a couple of questions on this side.
Needs more coffee. That's the benefit of the double coffee in the morning. So, Xavier and Emile, I think we know that the Darwin is a very important project. And we know the commitment that you both have, especially the advocacy of Xavier is doing inside the EMEA for patient data. I can confirm that. Patient-reported outcomes, though, have not been foreseen inside the design of Darwin, at least to the level we want, and real-world evidence when it comes from patients. What is the future?
I do not understand your question. That it has not been foreseen. Well, it depends on which data. Of course, we are selecting a very wide range of data sources in order to answer different types of questions. Hospitals database, database from primary care, database from patient organization. This type of database have different characteristics and may have different data that would be needed for different research questions, different objectives. So we would like to have patient-reported outcomes in some database. There are some for which they do not exist. Some hospital database where this is on, the data from intensive care, we will not have quality of life. But
maybe to add to that, I think the problem with PROs is not so much in Darwin. I think the problem is more that there aren't many PROs that are collected in standard clinical practice that are connected to the treatment data, right? Because a PRO standalone is nice, but it's not really useful unless you know the broader treatment and circumstance of a patient. So I think the question is not so much Darwin, but I think the question is more how do we incentivize the system to actually start administering more PROs, because then they will land in the data, then we'll see them in Darwin, then we can use them retrospectively. When I was treated, I didn't fill out any PROs. I had all kinds of feelings and emotions, but I didn't put a structured questionnaire on paper, but it would have been easy, right? And I would have done it if I were asked, but I wasn't asked. So I think it's a question on how we incentivize the system to start administering those, because it should be important to a clinician to know how their patient is doing, right? They always ask the question, but in an unstructured way. Why not ask people to fill out a survey? I think most patients would say, of course. I think that's more the question.
Thank you. So
It would be very helpful to have, and there's very few data sets that have this data.
We have one question there, and then one possibly there if moderators allow us, and a very final statement from everyone.
Yeah,
Please.
thank you, panel, for the interesting discussion. My name is Valerie. I'm a CF patient, and I'm also involved in the CF registry. And I like what you say, like we send a questionnaire and we are convinced that patients would be happy to answer. But yesterday I also learned that the biggest motivation for a patient to provide and share data is to improve his or her own care. So what can we and patient organizations do to also convince healthcare professionals to really value those PROM and patient-generated data and use them in clinical decision-making so that patients really see the value of sharing those type of data? Like, what can we do to really make sure that every stakeholder sees the value of those patient-generated data and acts upon?
Is it a question for patient organization?
A question from a patient's organization to a patient's organization. Well, as I was saying, we really have to work further with the healthcare professionals to bridge that gap that exists, because the patients are pushing for something that is not yet acknowledged by all the healthcare professionals, that's a fact, and the message is not going through. And we need the support of the systems to get there, to get to the healthcare professionals, because it's not just a matter of gathering data, it's also providing the time for dialogue, also with the patients to be able to collect the relevant data. And at this stage, it's a bit like we're in a transition phase where we are moving towards digitalization, which will help the process, but not everyone is there yet, neither the patients, neither the healthcare professionals. So there is a lot of work, systematic work to be done in terms of governance that needs to be solved, and that's why it's important to have the patient's voice represented in the decision makings, where the decisions are making for designing the frameworks of those governance. And then for the real-world evidence data, the education goes both directions for the patients, but also for the healthcare professionals. So I would encourage all the umbrella organizations for healthcare professionals to have the same initiative as we do to develop further the health literacy, or even to co-design with us those literacy that can help.
Okay.
And one very quick reaction.
It's a digital transformation, right? The advice I would give to the patient organizations is partner with those clinicians who want to work remotely with patients, because they need the prompts to be provided as part of their new model, right? So that's the benefit kind of a transformation. You can pick the partners who want what you also want and design it with them. So that's what would be my advice. Let's just choose very carefully who we partner with. And that would be the result of that, because they want it, not necessarily because patients want it.
So we have one comment there, one there, and I think then we have to stop and get to the closing.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion, which speaks very, very deeply to my heart. Together with Valentina, actually, we're working on a project exactly around collecting standardized PROs, but helping clinicians and patients using it as a common language. The project is only starting. It's been, so we hope we'll be going to real patients in a few months' time. But I have a very specific question, which is about the standardization of the PROs. Because when you start going into practice about how are we going to make the PROs a common language between patients and doctors so that it's mutually beneficiary, the one thing that you realize is the huge fragmentation of PROs. So our approach has been, or the philosophy that started emerging out of the project, is that it probably makes sense to try to agree on a relatively simple, or what we call it a Venn diagram of PROs, which captures several diseases, maybe not 100%, but 80%, but then allows the stakeholders, which is the clinicians and the patients, to have a structured conversation, to have an evidence-based conversation, and then eventually start asking or start complementing it with additional PROs. I would love to hear your perspective as to whether the data that will be emerging out of this conversation, which will inevitably be very useful for the two stakeholders, for their conversation, whether it will also be, or to which extent you think it will be useful also from a regulatory and a reimbursement perspective.
Anyone wants to comment?
I think it's for you.
Xavier?
Yeah, just can just respond as an epidemiologist rather than a regulator. Is that I fully agree, but the issue we have sometimes with PROs is the lack of validation, the lack of the differences that exist in the way they are collected, and when we have to take a decision and assess the information, we need to have confidence in the validity of this information, and therefore, and also I can speak actually from my previous life. I worked in for Alzheimer's, for dementia and quality of life and so on. So really, the validation stuff is very important. We need to have confidence in the validity of the data that have been collected, the data collection methods, how this has been done, and that internationally recognized PROs are being used.
So it's an evolving environment, let's say.
Yeah.
One last question over there, and then.
Good morning. My name is Hilde de Keizer, CEO of CF Europe, and I don't really have a question, but I want to give a remark to what Valerie said and others have been saying. And I think that one of the important words that I maybe didn't hear or didn't hear clear enough this morning is trust. We can only work together on this if there is trust between the different stakeholders, which is always the case in every space, but now we're moving into this space that is relatively new. We're moving into a position as patient organizations that is different, and I think we need to build trust together with all stakeholders in order to be able to do this in the best possible way and to do this in a way that is just what patients need.
Thank you. And now, one very last statement from everyone. Where do you see the role of patient organizations in real-world generation in 5 years? Oh, Elisabeth.
Very specific 5 years. Well, my wish, I will visualize it if everyone agrees with me, but at the moment it's my wish. I think, as Kristof was saying, I would like to see the patients' organization in the driving seats, being able to really design what is needed, but bring the patient's perspective and have a stronger contribution. And that's also something in the field of the PROs, the developments of the PROs, which is really important for patients, but still there is a lot of barriers to get there. So I would hope that in 5 years' time we have addressed that issue and already are in the driving seat.
Thank you. Emile?
Yes, I agree. I think that pivotal role there's for patient organization is there, and I would like to see them advanced. Maybe there's a couple of disease areas where it can start. Kristof, you presented 4. Maybe they can take a kind of a leading role because it's such a broad gamut of diseases that we talk about. Maybe in 5 years' time we can set 4 or 5 examples of patient organizations that are really able to take that role, have the resources to actually play that role properly. I think that would be a great outcome for the next 5 years.
Thank you. Xavier?
The patient organizations are very important. Now, real-world data, real-world evidence are becoming integrated increasingly into our medicine's evaluations and assessment. And real-world data, this is the patient's information. Only patients know what is the real world and the practice and what happens in the real life. So for us it is very important, and as I said earlier, they are integrated more and more into the evaluation and the authorizations of new medicines.
And finally, Kristof.
I would hope that from 5 years from now, the European ecosystem recognizes that European patient associations are key drivers in the competitiveness of the data available in the EU health data system at a global level. So thanks to patient organizations, we have deeper, broader, and better quality data and more trust in the ecosystem in Europe.
Thank you. And with this, I'd like to thank our panelists and I wish you a nice coffee break, and we will come back soon.
Hello, back.
Hello.
So,
No.
okay, thanks. Let's give a warm round of applause to the audience. Please.